What I'd like to do is just to offer a few reflections, if I may.
Please.
With your permission, I'll come to it even without your permission, on some of the issues that have been discussed. But just a very quick context. Look, we've had the biggest ever, or one of the biggest ever banking financial crises on record, and that has actually in turn led to one of the biggest ever changes in the regulatory regime. And that is precisely why, on the 10th anniversary of the crisis, we decided, or largely at the initiative of Maria, to actually have a special issue of the Journal of Financial Regulation and Compliance, which in turn is 50 years old in this year. And I'd just like to put on record from all of my co-editors the grateful thanks for all of the papers, all of the presentations that have been here today, to the extent that we still rejected some very good papers, and that one special issue turned into be two special issues, which I think is something of a record. So that, if you like, is the context in where we started from. This unprecedented response at three levels: monetary policy, enormous central bank liquidity and money market intervention. Again, unprecedented in virtually all dimensions: the type of assets, the type of intervention, the scale, the number of counterparties. All were moving central banks into completely new areas, and of course, as you know, the enormous expansion of their balance sheets and the regulatory regime. And I call it the regulatory regime at two levels, because I think this is also unique in regulatory history, that in response to the crisis, basically the regulators have had two objectives. And I would be very unimaginative. Objective one has been to reduce the probability of bank failure, and we all know about that: capital ratios, liquidity ratios, etc. And that is, if you like, incremental. It is really adding more to the traditional approach of trying to deal with bank solvency problems. But I think the second dimension, which I think makes it a new dimension, is that we're also trying to reduce the social costs, and I emphasize the word social costs, of those bank failures that will nevertheless still occur. Look, it's very easy to reduce the probability of bank failures to zero. Capital ratios of 50%, so on and so forth. That's not the point. If we know how to reduce the probability to zero, but we also know that we would never want to do that. And therefore, we will accept that the probability of failure is going to be greater than zero. And therefore, the second strand is, what can we do to lower the social cost of those bank failures that do occur? I don't think we're interested in the private cost, but we are interested in the social cost. And of course, this is where the resolution regimes come in, mainly to protect the taxpayer. So I think this is a revolutionary part of the regulatory response, those two key elements in tandem. There's just a list of all the massive interventions that you're familiar with all of those. So here we have Objective 1 and Objective 2. The key elements of the post-crisis regulatory strategy within that regime framework that I've just mentioned: lower the probability of bank failure, enhancing the resilience of banks, TLAC, tightening of supervision. I mean, in many ways, in my personal view, this was a crisis not of regulation, but of supervision. I'm not convinced that it was regulation that was the fundamental problem. The idea of early intervention. And finally, as I said, the lowering of the social cost of bank failures. That is, if in summary, what we have done. Now, a word about the future. going on a little bit from your earlier presentation about the priorities of the European Commission, I think there are certain key issues that we do need to think about going forward about the regulatory regime and how we should approach it. And I'm going to draw a little bit on the work of, when I was chairman of the Banking Stakeholder Group of EBA, we wrote a very long report on proportionality, which is actually on the website of the EBA. And a few bullet points just to think about where I think we ought to be thinking in the future. One is this proportionality issue. The problem here that we found is that although each and every individual regulation would actually satisfy a cost-benefit analysis, but it doesn't follow, with the fallacy of composition, it doesn't follow that the totality of regulation would actually pass or satisfy a cost-benefit analysis. In other words, the sum total of total may be negative. I just raise that as an issue. Very little analysis has been done about whether the totality of all of this regulation is actually proportional, and I think we do need a lot more thinking about that. Secondly, is there a relationship between Objective 1 and Objective 2? In the following sense, let me just put up a different one. Could there be a trade-off between the two? And could it be that we're constructing different regulations for Objective 1 without recognising that we're also doing a lot for Objective 2? And I'd like to illustrate that by a little bit of Alice in Wonderland thought process. Let us imagine the following, that through Objective 2, resolution, etc., we could reduce the social costs of bank failures to zero. Now, of course, we're not going to do that, but just as a thought process, there are no social costs to bank failures. What would follow from that? Well, I don't think we care about the probability of bank failings. I mean, if there are no social costs to a bank failure, why worry about it? Secondly, that would solve the bailout problem, because there's no point in bailing out a failed bank if there are no costs attached to that bank failing. Fairly logical. There'd be no taxpayer liability. There's no moral hazard attached to bailouts. But also, actually, we wouldn't need any regulation for Objective 1. We could abandon the whole lot if there are zero social costs. So let me be clear. I'm not saying that we're anywhere near that, or either theoretically or empirically we could get anywhere near that. What I am saying is whether we ought to have a look at what we've done for Objective 1 in the context of what we have done for Objective 2. So all I would say is there is something of a trade-off between the degree of success on Objective 2 and the optimum level of regulation for Objective 1. And as I say in a previous... so, if you like, the optimum level of regulation for Objective 1, which most of the discussion today has been about, is indeterminate without knowing exactly what we've done and with what degree of success we've done for Objective 2. My third issue for the future, I think we do need to look again at this relationship between the risk-weight assets approach and the leverage approach. Not wishing to put any of my dear friends and colleagues out of business, I think the RWA approach is fundamentally flawed in so many different ways. not only in terms of the actual coefficients that are applied, but more fundamentally. And therefore I wonder whether we ought to be giving more emphasis to the leverage requirements rather than the risk-weighted assets. My fourth issue that we highlighted in the BSG report is the degree of complexity. Most of my colleagues had argued quite strongly and convincingly that the same degree of impact of regulation could be achieved with much less complexity of regulation, and that excess complexity is itself a cost over and above what could be achieved with a much more simple way. And that's why I've underlined the word excess. Of course regulation has to be complex because banking problems are complex. So it's a degree to which that complexity. And we shouldn't actually confuse precision versus accuracy. The risk-weight assets approach is very precise, but in many different ways it's not very accurate. So I think there is an issue there. Differentiation. Is there a case for greater differentiation as between different types of banks, whether we're talking about small versus large or stakeholder value banks versus shareholder value banks? I think there is an issue there. And my final 2 points come back to what Charles was talking about. And I think it's always nice when you leave a conference to go away with something completely new. And here's something completely new for you, a word. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, anthropomorphization. That's what you've learned today. And this is, as Charles described it, he is assuming that institutions actually are treated as if they were individuals. And as Charles was saying, it's not banks that make decisions, it's individuals that make decisions. And I think we need to know a lot more about what actually motivates decision making in banking. And this leads on, so I've reversed it. I believe that culture has become a major, or should become, a major supervisory issue. That supervisors ought to be looking at the, if you like, the underlying culture that exists within banks. Quickly. Well, I think culture has become an important issue, the crisis, etc. The avoidance of individual responsibility. And what is culture about? It's about values, ethical standards, above all, internal incentive structures. Why is culture important? I think for these reasons. It creates business standards, it influences employees' attitudes, it does determine behaviour. And so my argument here is that if the underlying culture within a bank is hazardous, there's not a great deal that regulation can do. And therefore, if you focus more on what is the underlying culture of Bank A, Bank B, Bank C, I think this will be quite a fruitful approach. Very difficult in practice. I'm involved with some research in trying to measure that, but nevertheless I think it is an important issue. So my final slide, you'll be glad to know, could it be, well an earlier slide, which I haven't had time to look at for your benefit, I think culture has deteriorated, or rather did deteriorate very strongly in global banking in the years running up to the crisis. Many different reasons for that. Incentive structures are hazardous, the short-termism approach, cutting corners, the shift from relationship banking to transaction banking. A lot of reasons why I think culture did deteriorate. Could it be, my final remark then, that regulation had something to do with the deterioration in the fundamental underlying cultures? Why might it have done that? Perhaps because it forced banks to focus on the letter of the law, the detail of the regulation, rather than what is the right thing to do. We did some research through EBA and a previous regulatory agency I was involved with on bankers' attitude to regulation. And time and again it came up, the more you make regulation complex and extensive, the more we're going to say, if a particular behaviour is not covered by regulation, then it's okay. And I think that became part of the culture. And finally, it became a box-ticking mentality. So what I'm saying here is I think there are some fairly fundamental issues that I think would be profitable for us to think about in the next years going forward about reform of the regulatory regime. At which point, Charles, I'm going to call in the safari principle. I don't know how many of you ever had the pleasure of going on safari. It is a fact in African states anyway that the majority of people who are killed on safari are killed by the hippopotamus, not by the lion. And there is a reason for that the hippopotamus, their natural habitat is the water. But you know, they do come out of the water. A hippopotamus is virtually blind, but has fantastic hearing. And if you stand in between a hippopotamus and the water, you will be dead. Because that hippopotamus feels threatened. You are stopping it from getting into its natural habitat, and he will then charge you, and you will be dead. Now, what's that got to do with our position tonight? Well, there is a hippopotamus principle that I've learned over many years, that if you stand in between a banker, a regulator or an academic, and a good dinner, exactly the same thing will happen. You'll be trampled to death. And so I think I will now leave the